A tale of werewolves, alphas, and fated destinies, written by Olivia Stone. The bonfire crackled and spat embers into the cold autumn night, sending sparks spiraling upward toward a moon that hung fat and silver in the sky like a judgment waiting to be passed. And I stood there in the ceremonial clearing with my heart hammering so hard against my ribs that I was certain everyone in the Iron Ridge pack could hear it, could sense the terror and anticipation warring inside me as I waited for Damien to speak the words that would bind us together forever. My silver hair, that long cascade of metallic moonlight that had always made me different, made me strange, made me whispered about in corridors and avoided in crowds, hung loose around my shoulders the way Damien liked it, the way he'd always told me it was beautiful despite what everyone else said, and I'd spent hours brushing it until it shone like polished steel in the firelight, wanting to be perfect for this moment, wanting to be everything he needed me to be. The entire pack had gathered for our mating ceremony, nearly 200 wolves arranged in a circle around the sacred fire, their faces painted with shadows and flame light, their expressions ranging from curiosity to pity to something that looked uncomfortably like relief. And I told myself that once Damien claimed me, once we were officially bonded, all those whispers and sideways glances would stop, because I would finally belong to someone, would finally be more than just the strange, silver-haired orphan who nobody quite knew what to do with. Damien stood across from me in the firelight, tall and strong, and everything an alpha's son should be, his dark hair gleaming almost black in contrast to my silver, his green eyes reflecting the flames as he looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, and I felt a flutter of uncertainty in my stomach that I immediately tried to suppress because this was Damien, my Damien, the boy who'd been my friend since we were children, who'd protected me from bullies, who'd held my hand when my parents died in that rogue attack 16 years ago, who'd promised me over and over that my appearance didn't matter, that he loved me exactly as I was. We'd been together for 6 years, had planned this ceremony for months, had talked late into the night about the life we'd build together, the children we'd have, the future that stretched out before us like a golden road. And I'd believed every word because what else did I have to hold on to except the hope that someone, anyone, could look past my cursed appearance and see the person underneath, could love me not, despite my strangeness, but simply because I was me. Alpha Iron Ridge, Damien's father and the pack's leader, stepped forward to officiate the ceremony, his massive frame blocking out the firelight for a moment as he moved between us, his gray-streaked beard and weathered face making him look like something carved from ancient stone, and his voice boomed out across the clearing with the kind of authority that made even the wind seem to hold its breath in respect. We gather tonight under the light of the full moon to witness the mating bond between Damien Ironridge, second son of the Alpha line, and Sarah Nightshade, Omega of this pack, he announced, and I felt every eye in the clearing shift to me, felt the weight of their judgment and their assessment, felt myself being measured and found wanting in 100 small ways that added up to a lifetime of not quite belonging. Damien Ironridge, do you accept this woman as your mate, to bond with her under the moon goddess's blessing, to mark her as yours and claim her before all witnesses gathered here tonight? This was it, the moment I'd been waiting for, the moment when everything would change, when I would finally stop being the strange outsider and become someone's chosen one, someone's mate, someone's future. And I held my breath as I waited for Damien to say the words, to step forward and take my hands, to look into my eyes with all the love and promise he'd shown me over the years. But something was wrong. I could feel it in the sudden tension that rippled through his shoulders, in the way his jaw clenched and his hands curled into fists at his sides, in the way his eyes wouldn't quite meet mine even though we stood barely 10 feet apart with the sacred fire burning between us. The silence stretched out like a living thing, thick and suffocating, and I saw Alpha Iron Ridge's eyebrows draw together in confusion, saw the crowd begin to shift and murmur with uncertainty, saw Damien's mother press a hand to her mouth as though she already knew what was coming and was trying to hold back either words or sobs. "I cannot," Damien said finally, and his voice was loud enough to carry across the entire clearing, loud enough to silence every whisper and every breath, loud enough to shatter my heart into pieces so small I wasn't sure they could ever be put back together. "I cannot accept this bond," he continued, and now he was looking at me, really looking at me, and there was something in his eyes that was worse than hatred, worse than disgust, something that looked almost like pity mixed with revulsion, and I felt my knees go weak as I realized what was happening, realized that this couldn't be real, couldn't be happening. Not here, not now, not after everything we'd been through together. "Sarah Nightshade, I reject you as my mate," he said, and the formal words of rejection fell from his lips like stones dropping into still water, sending ripples of shock and scandal spreading through the assembled pack, and I heard gasps and whispered exclamations, but they seemed to come from very far away, as though I was drowning and the surface was receding above me faster than I could swim. "You cannot be serious," I managed to whisper, my voice coming out thin and broken, nothing like the confident tone I'd practiced in my room while preparing for tonight, while imagining how I would say my own vows, while dreaming of the moment Damien would mark my neck and claim me as his forever. "Damien, please, we've been planning this for months. You said you loved me. You said my silver hair was beautiful. You said—" But he cut me off with a sharp gesture, his hand slicing through the air between us like a blade. And when he spoke again, his voice had gone cold in a way I'd never heard before, in a way that made him sound like a stranger wearing Damien's face. "I was wrong," he said flatly, and every word felt like a physical blow, like claws raking across my chest and tearing out my heart piece by bloody piece. "I thought I could overlook your appearance, thought I could convince myself that it didn't matter, that love would be enough to overcome the obvious problems with binding myself to someone who looks like a ghost, like death itself, like something unnatural and wrong." And the crowd was murmuring louder now, some agreeing with nods and muttered assents, some looking uncomfortable but not uncomfortable enough to speak up in my defense, and I realized with a sick lurch in my stomach that this had been building for a while, that Damien hadn't woken up tonight and suddenly decided to reject me, that he'd been thinking about this, planning it, maybe even discussing it with others behind my back. "My brother died 3 months ago in that border battle," Damien continued, his voice rising with something that sounded almost like righteousness, like he was justifying himself not just to me, but to the entire pack, to the moon goddess herself. "And with Marcus gone, I'm now the heir to the alpha position. I'm next in line to lead this pack, and I will not, bind myself to a mate who would weaken that position, who would give me weak pups, cursed pups, children that the pack would whisper about and distrust the same way they whisper about and distrust you." The words hit me like silver bullets, each one finding its mark with devastating precision, and I felt something break inside me that had nothing to do with the mate bond we'd never actually formed, and everything to do with the realization that the person I'd loved, the person I'd trusted with my deepest fears and my most vulnerable hopes, had just used those same fears as weapons against me in front of everyone I'd ever known. "Your silver hair is a curse," Damien said, and now he was pointing at me, actually pointing like I was something to be identified and warned against. Something dangerous that needed to be called out and isolated. Everyone knows it, everyone sees it, and I was a fool to think I could ignore what the moon goddess has clearly marked you as, what your appearance has always screamed to anyone with eyes to see. And I wanted to scream at him that it was just hair, just a genetic quirk that ran in my family line, that my mother had silver hair and my grandmother before her, that it didn't mean anything except that I was different. But my throat had closed up completely, and I couldn't force any sounds past the crushing weight of humiliation and betrayal that was sitting on my chest like a boulder. "I reject you, Sarah Nightshade," Damien repeated, making it formal and official and completely irrevocable. "And I claim my right as the rejecting party to demand that you leave Pact territory by dawn, because I cannot in good conscience allow someone I've rejected to remain where they might cause problems or conflicts or constant reminders of this night." The crowd erupted at that, some shouting agreement, while others protested that banishment was too harsh for someone who'd done nothing wrong. But Alpha Ironridge held up a massive hand for silence, and when the clearing finally quieted, he looked at me with something that might have been sympathy, if it hadn't been mixed with so much obvious relief that his son hadn't actually gone through with binding himself to the weird silver-haired girl after all. "The rejection is witnessed and accepted," Alpha Ironridge announced in his booming voice, making it official pack law, making it something that couldn't be undone, or taken back, or fixed with apologies or explanations. "Sarah Nightshade, you have until dawn to gather your belongings and leave Ironridge territory, and you are hereby forbidden from returning under penalty of execution for trespassing." And I noticed he didn't even try to argue with his son's demand for banishment, didn't offer me the option of staying on as a regular pack member, didn't give me any alternative except exile, and I understood with crushing clarity that this was what they'd all wanted anyway, that Damien's rejection had just given them the excuse they needed to finally get rid of the strange girl who'd never quite fit in, who reminded them of death and curses and things they didn't want to think about. I stood there for a moment that felt like an eternity, my silver hair lifting slightly in the wind that had picked up around the clearing, my violet-gray eyes burning with tears that I absolutely refused to let fall in front of all these people who'd just watched me be publicly humiliated and destroyed, my hands clenched so tight at my sides that my nails were drawing blood from my palms, and I looked at Damien one last time, really looked at him, trying to find any trace of the boy who'd held my hand and told me I was beautiful. But all I saw was a stranger who'd just proven that love was conditional, that acceptance could be withdrawn at any moment, that I truly was as alone in the world as I'd always feared I was. Without a word, because what words could possibly be adequate for this moment? What could I possibly say that would matter, or change anything, or make any of this hurt less? I turned and walked out of the ceremonial clearing, my back straight and my head high, despite the fact that my entire world had just collapsed around me like a house built on sand. And I heard the whispers start up behind me, heard the relief in some voices and the pity in others. Heard someone say, "It's for the best, really," and someone else respond, "Poor thing, never stood a chance with that cursed appearance." And I kept walking, because if I stopped, if I let myself pause even for a second, I would collapse completely, and I would never get back up. I made it back to the small room I'd occupied in the pack house, the tiny space that had been mine for the past 16 years since my parents died, and I moved through it like a ghost, like the very thing Damien had called me, gathering my few possessions into the worn canvas bag that had belonged to my father. I didn't have much because orphans never did. Because when you were dependent on pack charity, you learned not to accumulate things, not to get attached to possessions that could be taken away as easily as love and acceptance apparently could. And within 20 minutes, I had everything I owned in the world condensed down to one bag that weighed almost nothing and somehow felt like it weighed more than I could possibly carry. My mother's book of children's stories, the only thing I had left of her besides my silver hair and my cursed appearance, went in carefully wrapped in a spare shirt, and I ran my fingers over the worn leather cover one more time, remembering her voice reading to me before she died, remembering feeling safe and loved, and certain that the world was a good place where good things happened to people who deserved them. And I wondered when exactly I'd lost that certainty, when I'd started believing that maybe I really was cursed, maybe I really was meant to be alone. I left the pack house without saying goodbye to anyone because there was no one to say goodbye to, no one who would mourn my leaving or wish me well or tell me they'd miss me. And I walked through the sleeping pack territory as the moon climbed higher in the sky and the autumn wind cut through my thin cloak like it was made of paper instead of wool. I should have been terrified, should have been panicking about where I would go or how I would survive alone in the wilderness with winter coming on fast. But instead, I felt numb, felt hollowed out and empty, felt like Damien had reached into my chest and ripped out everything that made me human and left nothing behind but this shell that kept walking because it didn't know what else to do. I didn't stop at the pack border, didn't look back at the only home I'd ever known, didn't let myself think about the fact that I was now completely and utterly alone in the world, with no pack, no family, no friends, no future, nothing except a bag of worthless possessions and a heart that had been shattered so thoroughly that I wasn't sure it would ever beat properly again. I walked north because south led back toward Iron Ridge territory, and east and west led to other established packs who would take one look at my silver hair and my lack of pack affiliation and turn me away just like everyone else always had. But north led into the mountains, into the wilderness, into territory that was unclaimed and dangerous and perfect for someone who had nothing left to lose. And as I walked through the dark forest with branches catching at my hair and roots trying to trip my feet, I felt the first tear finally escape and roll down my cheek, followed by another and another until I was crying silently as I walked, mourning not just the loss of Damien or the loss of my pack, but the loss of the naive girl who'd believed that love could overcome anything, who'd believed that she deserved happiness, who'd believed that her silver hair was beautiful instead of cursed. And somewhere in the darkness behind me, a wolf howled, long and lonely and perfectly capturing everything I felt in that moment. And I kept walking into the unknown because what else was there left to do except survive? And surviving was the only thing I'd ever really been good at anyway. 3 days of walking through increasingly treacherous mountain terrain had stripped away whatever remained of my naive hopes and replaced them with the brutal clarity that comes from true desperation, from knowing that death is no longer some distant abstract concept, but rather a very real possibility that grows more likely with each hour that passes, with each degree the temperature drops, with each moment my exhausted body continues to push forward through wilderness that was never meant for a lone Omega, with no survival skills and no destination in mind, except away from everything that hurt me. My silver hair, that cursed marker of my difference that Damien had used as justification for destroying me, had become a practical nightmare in the wilderness because it caught on every branch and thorn, because it tangled into impossible knots that I didn't have the energy to properly brush out, because it seemed to actively attract the attention of every bird and small creature that saw it glinting in the weak autumn sunlight and wondered if perhaps I was some strange new type of plant or mineral deposit worth investigating. My supplies had dwindled to almost nothing because I'd left with barely more than a day's worth of food, and I'd been stretching it as far as possible, rationing the dried meat and stale bread into portions so small they did nothing to quiet the gnawing hunger in my stomach. And I'd been drinking from mountain streams that were so cold they made my teeth ache, but at least kept me from dying of thirst, even as my body slowly began to shut down from lack of proper nourishment and warmth and rest. The afternoon of the third day brought changes in the weather that I was too exhausted and too inexperienced to properly read, brought a heaviness to the air and a metallic taste on my tongue and a strange greenish quality to the light filtering through the pine trees. But I kept walking because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering Damien's face as he rejected me, meant hearing his words about cursed children and unnatural appearance echoing in my mind on an endless loop, meant acknowledging that I was completely and utterly alone in the world, with no purpose and no future, and no reason to keep breathing, except that my stupid, stubborn body refused to give up, even when my mind and heart had already surrendered. I should have been paying more attention to the forest around me, should have noticed how the birds had gone silent, and the small animals had disappeared into their burrows, should have recognized the warning signs that every creature with functioning survival instincts was heeding, while I stumbled forward in my grief-induced haze. But I was too lost in my own misery to notice anything beyond the next step, and the next breath, and the next moment of somehow continuing to exist in a world that clearly didn't want me. The blizzard hit with a violence that seemed almost personal, seemed almost like the moon goddess herself had looked down at my silver-haired, cursed existence and decided that since the pack had rejected me and banishment hadn't killed me quickly enough, she would take matters into her own divine hands and finish the job with wind and ice and cold that cut through my inadequate cloak like it was made of spider silk instead of wool. One moment, I was walking through normal autumn weather with just a hint of chill in the air, and the next moment the sky had opened up and was dumping snow so thick and fast that I couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction, couldn't tell which way was forward or back or up or down, couldn't do anything except throw my arms up to protect my face from the wind that was strong enough to knock me off my feet and send me stumbling sideways into a tree trunk that I hit hard enough to see stars exploding across my vision. The temperature plummeted so fast that I could actually feel my exposed skin beginning to freeze, could feel my fingers and toes going numb despite my desperate attempts to keep moving and generate body heat, could feel my silver hair becoming weighted down with ice crystals that formed so quickly they seemed to appear out of nowhere, transforming my cursed locks into frozen ropes that hung heavy and cold against my back and shoulders. I was going to die. I realized, with a strange sense of calm acceptance, that probably meant I was already entering the first stages of hypothermia, already beginning the process of shutting down that would end with me as just another frozen corpse in the mountains that would be found in spring by some hunter or traveler who would look at my silver hair and probably assume I'd been cursed, probably assume I'd deserved whatever fate had brought me to such a lonely end. And perhaps they wouldn't even be wrong, because maybe Damien had been right all along. Maybe I really was cursed. Maybe my appearance really was a sign from the moon goddess that I was meant to suffer and struggle and ultimately die alone without ever finding the belonging and acceptance that seemed to come so easily to everyone else. The thought should have made me sad, but instead, it just made me tired, made me want to lie down in the snow and let it cover me like a blanket. Let the cold numb everything until there was nothing left to feel. No more rejection to remember. No more loneliness to endure. No more desperate hoping that somewhere in the world there might be a place for a silver-haired Omega who'd never quite fit in anywhere. But even as I was making peace with my own death, even as I was preparing to simply stop fighting and let nature take its course, my feet kept moving forward through the snow that was now up to my knees, kept pushing through drifts that threatened to trap me with every step, kept carrying me onward because my body apparently hadn't gotten the message that my mind had already given up. I stumbled down what felt like a steep embankment, my feet sliding out from under me on the ice-covered slope, and I fell hard, tumbling and rolling through the snow and rocks until I crashed into something solid at the bottom, something that knocked the air from my lungs and left me gasping and dizzy and barely conscious, lying in a heap at the base of what looked like a cliff face, or maybe the side of the mountain itself. Through my blurred and snow-crusted vision, I could just barely make out a darker patch in the rock face ahead of me, a shadow that might have been a cave, or might have been just a shallow depression, but either way represented the only possible shelter I was likely to find, and I crawled toward it on hands and knees, because standing was beyond me now, because my legs were shaking too badly to support my weight, because every movement felt like pushing through honey, and my thoughts were getting slower and fuzzier in a way that some distant part of my mind recognized as very, very dangerous. The cave entrance was partially hidden by an outcropping of rock and a curtain of icicles that hung down like teeth in some frozen monster's mouth. But I pushed through them with desperate determination, hearing them shatter and feeling shards of ice cut into my already frozen hands, and I half crawled, half dragged myself into the darkness beyond, into shelter from the wind that was literally screaming now like something alive and furious at being denied its prey. The cave went back farther than I'd expected, the entrance tunnel opening up into a larger chamber after about 15 feet, and the temperature inside was noticeably warmer than outside, even though warmer was relative when you were already half frozen and hypothermic. But at least the wind couldn't reach me here. At least the snow had stopped pelting my face and body with tiny frozen daggers. At least I had a chance to catch my breath and assess the damage and figure out if I was going to survive the night or if I just traded dying in a blizzard for dying slightly more slowly in a cave. That was when I heard it, a sound that cut through my hypothermic confusion and my exhausted resignation like a knife through butter. A sound that made every protective instinct I didn't even know I possessed suddenly roar to life with an intensity that was almost painful in its urgency, a sound that was unmistakably, heartbreakingly, the crying of children. Not the howling of wolf pups, not the yipping of young animals, but actual children's voices, human voices, speaking in words that were muffled and frightened, but definitely, absolutely human. And I froze in place, trying to process what I was hearing, because it made no sense, because what would children be doing alone in a cave in the middle of a mountain range during a blizzard that was currently trying to murder anyone foolish enough to be caught outside? My healer's heart, that part of me that had always been drawn to helping others, even when it meant putting myself in danger, even when it meant getting hurt or rejected for my troubles, overrode every survival instinct that was screaming at me to stay put and conserve what little energy I had left. And I forced my frozen legs to move, forced my exhausted body to push deeper into the cave toward the source of those heartbreaking sounds. And as I rounded a bend in the tunnel and emerged into a larger chamber, I saw them, and my heart simultaneously broke and swelled with purpose. 6 children, ranging in age from maybe 4 years old to perhaps 10, were huddled together in the back of the cave like a litter of puppies trying to share body heat. and in the dim light filtering in from the cave entrance, I could see that they were in terrible condition. Could see that several were shivering violently with what was clearly fever, or hypothermia, or both. Could see that one boy's leg was bent at an angle that made my stomach turn, because that was definitely broken, and badly at that. Could see cuts and bruises and signs of trauma that spoke of violence and terror and desperate flight from something or someone who'd meant them harm. But what made my breath catch in my throat, what made my already racing heart stutter and skip, what made everything else fade into insignificance, was the fact that every single one of these children had silver hair, had that same metallic moonlight coloring that I'd been cursed with, that Damien had used as justification for my rejection, that had marked me as different and wrong and unnatural my entire life, and seeing it reflected back at me in 6 small faces made something crack open in my chest that had nothing to do with physical pain and everything to do with recognition, with connection, with the sudden, impossible understanding that I wasn't alone in my strangeness after all. The oldest child, a girl with silver blonde hair that hung in tangled waves around a face that would have been beautiful if it wasn't currently pale and terrified, and marked with a cut across her forehead that was still sluggishly bleeding, saw me first and immediately positioned herself between me and the younger children, her gray eyes fierce despite her obvious exhaustion and pain, and I recognized in her expression everything I'd felt my entire life, that desperate need to protect, to shield, to stand between the vulnerable and the dangers of the world, even when you were barely more than a child yourself and had no real power to make a difference. "Stay back," she said, her voice trying for threatening, but coming out thin and scared. Trying for strong, but breaking on the second word. "We're not afraid of you. We'll fight if we have to. We're not going to just let you hurt us without trying to defend ourselves." The other children pressed closer together behind her, the youngest ones crying softly while the older ones tried to look brave, and I could see in their eyes that they expected me to be a threat, expected me to be just another source of pain and danger in a world that had clearly already hurt them far too much. "I'm not going to hurt you," I managed to say through chattering teeth, my voice coming out rough and broken from cold and exhaustion and the sheer overwhelming emotion of finding these children here, of seeing my own cursed silver hair reflected in their small faces, of recognizing in their situation something that resonated with my own abandonment and rejection and desperate survival. "I'm lost too. I'm alone too. I'm just trying to survive the storm like you are, and some of you are hurt very badly, and I might be able to help if you'll let me. If you'll trust me enough to let me try." I slowly pulled back the hood of my ice-crusted cloak, letting my own silver hair tumble free in all its frozen, tangled glory, letting them see that I was like them at least in this one crucial way. And I watched their expressions shift from terror to confusion to a tentative, desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, someone had finally come who wouldn't hurt them, who might actually help them, who understood what it meant to be marked by silver hair in a world that saw it as a curse. The girl with the bleeding forehead stared at my hair for a long moment, her gray eyes tracking from the silver strands to my face and back again, and I could see her making calculations, weighing risks, trying to decide if my similar appearance made me trustworthy or if it was just another trick, another danger in a world that had clearly taught her that danger could come from anywhere and anyone. "You have silver hair like us," she said finally, her voice still wary, but with a thread of something else woven through it. Something that might have been relief or recognition, or just the desperate need to believe that help had finally arrived. Are you from the north too? Are you from our Father's kingdom? Did he send you to find us and bring us home? Her questions came faster now, tumbling over each other with increasing urgency, and I saw hope starting to bloom in her expression, even as confusion bloomed in mine. Because what kingdom? What father? What was she talking about? But before I could ask for clarification, one of the younger children, a tiny boy who couldn't have been more than 4 years old, with silvery gray hair and huge frightened eyes, let out a whimper that turned into a sob. "I want Papa," he cried, his little voice breaking on the word. "I want Papa to come find us. I want to go home. I want the bad wolves to go away and never come back." And the older girl immediately turned to comfort him, gathering him into her arms and making soothing sounds while shooting me glances that were equal parts pleading and threatening, begging me to help while simultaneously warning me that if I tried anything to harm these children, she would fight me with everything she had left. I pushed down all my questions about kingdoms and fathers and bad wolves, pushed down my own exhaustion and pain and hypothermia, pushed down everything except the immediate and overwhelming need to help these children who were clearly in desperate trouble, who were injured and sick and terrified, who needed someone to step up and take care of them, even if that someone was just a rejected Omega with no training and no resources and barely enough strength left to take care of herself. "Let me help," I said, and this time my voice came out stronger, came out with a conviction I didn't entirely feel, but that these children needed to hear. "Let me look at your injuries and see what I can do, and then we'll figure out the rest together. We'll keep each other warm and wait out the storm and survive this, because that's what we have to do. That's the only option we have." The next few hours became a blur of desperate action fueled by pure determination, and the kind of adrenaline that comes from knowing that lives depend on you, that if you fail, these children will die, and you'll have to live with that failure forever, assuming you survive long enough to live with anything at all. I used my small knife and strips torn from my spare clothing to fashion a rough splint for the boy with the broken leg, a child of about 8 with dark silver hair and blue eyes, who tried so hard not to cry as I set the bone that my own eyes filled with tears of sympathy and rage at whatever had hurt these innocent children so badly. I melted snow in my water flask, held over a tiny fire I managed to coax into existence using dry debris from the back of the cave and the flint I'd found in my father's old bag, and I used the warm water to clean wounds and try to get fluids into the 3 children who were clearly running dangerous fevers, who were shivering and mumbling incoherently, and whose skin felt like fire under my cold fingers. I gave them what was left of my food, even though my own stomach was cramping with hunger, even though I knew I was giving away my last chance at maintaining my own strength. Because they were children, and they were suffering, and I wouldn't, let them starve while I hoarded resources for myself. As I worked, the children gradually began to trust me, began to talk in fragments about what had happened to them, and the story that emerged made my blood run cold, even as it filled me with a protective fury so intense it was almost frightening in its strength. They'd been traveling with guards, 12 warriors who were supposed to protect them, when they'd been ambushed by rogues 3 days ago in these very mountains, and the guards had fought valiantly, but had ultimately told the children to run and hide, while the warriors held off the attackers. And these 6 terrified children had fled into this cave and had been waiting ever since for the guards to come back, for their father to find them, for someone, anyone, to rescue them from this nightmare. The oldest girl, who told me her name was Astrid and who spoke with the kind of careful dignity that suggested she'd been raised with status and responsibility, refused to tell me exactly who their father was, would only say that he was from the north and that he was looking for them and that they had to stay alive until he found them because he would never stop searching, would tear apart the entire mountain range stone by stone if necessary to recover his children. I was settling the youngest boy, little Rune, who had finally stopped crying and fallen into an exhausted sleep in my lap, when I heard it. The sound that made every drop of blood in my body turn to ice, made every hair on my body stand straight up in primal recognition of mortal danger, made my newly awakened protective instincts roar to life with an intensity that actually hurt. Voices outside the cave, rough and cruel voices that were getting closer, voices that were talking about royal brats and making sure there are no survivors, and the boss said to finish the job. And I understood with crystal clarity that the rogues who'd attacked these children's guards 3 days ago had come back to finish what they'd started, had tracked the children to this cave, had come to murder 6 innocent silver-haired pups who'd done nothing wrong except be born to someone important enough that killing them mattered to whoever had ordered this attack. Astrid's eyes went wide with terror as she heard the voices too, and the other children who were conscious began to whimper and cry, pressing closer together in the back of the cave like cornered prey. And I looked down at little Rune, sleeping trustingly in my arms, looked at these 6 silver-haired children who reminded me so much of myself, who'd been hurt and abandoned and left to die, just like I had been. And I felt something shift inside me, felt something wake up that had been sleeping my entire life, felt power and purpose and absolute unshakable determination flood through me like liquid fire. I carefully transferred Rune to Astrid's arms, meeting her terrified gray eyes with what I hoped was a look of confidence and strength, even though inside I was absolutely terrified, absolutely certain I was about to die, but equally certain that I would die fighting rather than let these monsters touch one hair on these children's silver heads. "Stay here," I whispered to Astrid. "Stay quiet. Keep the little ones calm, and no matter what you hear, no matter what happens, do not come out of this cave until either I come back for you or your father finds you. Do you understand me?" She nodded, tears streaming down her face, and I saw in her expression that she knew I was going out there to face the rogues alone, knew I was probably going to die, knew she was watching someone sacrifice themselves for her and her siblings, and hating that she was too small and too young and too helpless to do anything about it. I turned toward the cave entrance, toward the voices that were getting louder and closer and more confident, toward what was almost certainly my death, but also toward the only choice I could live with, the only option that would let me face whatever came after, with the knowledge that I'd finally done something that mattered, that I'd protected innocence, that I'd stood between the vulnerable and the monsters, even though I was just a rejected Omega, with no training and no backup and nothing to fight with except desperate determination and a small knife that would probably break on the first strike. I stepped out of the cave into the dying light of late afternoon, into snow that was still falling through the worst of the blizzard had passed, into the faces of 5 rogues who looked at my silver hair and my small frame and my inadequate knife and started laughing, actually laughing like I was the funniest thing they'd seen in years. Like the idea of me being any kind of threat was so absurd, it was hilarious. And their laughter made something inside me snap, made rage and protective fury, and every single moment of rejection and dismissal and being told I wasn't good enough or strong enough or brave enough crystallize into a diamond-hard core of absolute resolution. "You're not getting past me," I said, my voice steady and cold and completely unrecognizable as my own. "You're not touching those children. You're not hurting them any more than you already have, And if you want to get to them, you're going to have to go through me first. And even though I was terrified, even though I knew I was outmatched and outnumbered and almost certainly about to die, I meant every single word with every fiber of my being. And as the rogues' laughter died, and their expressions shifted to something predatory and cruel and hungry, as they began to circle me like the monsters they were, I felt my eyes begin to glow with a silver light I didn't understand, felt strength flood into my exhausted limbs, felt something ancient and powerful and protective wake up inside me and take control. And I realized that maybe, just maybe, my silver hair wasn't a curse after all, but rather a mark of something far older and far more dangerous than any of us had ever imagined. And these rogues were about to find out exactly what happened when you threatened the children of someone who'd just discovered she had absolutely nothing left to lose and everything in the world to fight for. The fight that followed was something out of a nightmare, or perhaps more accurately out of a dream I didn't know I was capable of having, a revelation of strength and speed and primal protective fury that transformed me from a rejected Omega into something far more dangerous, something that made the rogue's confident smirks fade into expressions of shock and then terror as I moved with a grace and power that shouldn't have been possible for someone in my condition, for someone who'd been half dead from hypothermia and starvation just hours before. My small knife found the first rogue's throat before he could even finish raising his claws to strike, found the major artery with a precision that suggested muscle memory I didn't possess, combat training I'd never received, instincts that were rising from somewhere deep inside me that had nothing to do with my conscious mind and everything to do with the silver light that was now pouring from my eyes and illuminating the snowy clearing like moonlight made solid and weaponized. The second rogue managed to get his claws into my ribs, tearing through cloth and flesh and sending blood spraying across the pristine snow. But the pain that should have dropped me to my knees instead just fed the fury burning in my chest, just gave the protective instinct more fuel to burn. And I spun inside his guard and drove my knife upward under his chin, watching with grim satisfaction as his eyes went wide with surprise and then empty as he collapsed. 3 rogues remained, and they were no longer laughing, were no longer treating me like a joke or an easy target, were instead backing away with fear written clearly across their scarred faces, because they'd just watched a small Omega woman kill 2 of their packmates with a speed and efficiency that spoke of something supernatural, something blessed or cursed, or perhaps both at once, and I could see them reassessing their options, could see them wondering if murdering 6 silver-haired children was really worth dying for, could see the moment they decided that maybe retreat was the better part of valor. But I couldn't let them retreat, couldn't let them go back to whoever had hired them and report the children's location, couldn't risk them returning with reinforcements or finding another way to hurt the innocents I'd sworn to protect. And so, I launched myself at the nearest rogue with a snarl that didn't sound human, with claws that had somehow extended from my fingertips even though I wasn't shifted, with strength that let me tackle a wolf 3 times my size and bring him down hard enough to crack the frozen ground beneath us. We rolled across the snow in a tangle of limbs and blood and desperation, his teeth snapping inches from my throat while my hands found his eyes and dug in with merciless determination. And when he finally went limp beneath me, I was already moving toward the next threat, already positioning myself between the cave entrance and the 2 remaining rogues who were now openly terrified and backing toward the tree line. That was when I heard it, a sound that made the very air vibrate with power and authority and barely contained violence, a howl that echoed through the mountains like thunder rolling down from the peaks, like the voice of winter itself given sound and fury, like every legend about ancient predators and apex hunters made manifest in a single sustained note that spoke of dominance and protection and the absolute promise of destruction for anyone foolish enough to threaten what was his. The two remaining rogues heard it too, and their faces went from frightened to absolutely panic-stricken, and one of them actually whimpered, "The Viking King!" in a voice that was half prayer and half curse, before they both turned and ran into the forest with the kind of speed that only pure terror can produce, crashing through underbrush and snowdrifts with complete disregard for stealth or dignity, just desperate to put distance between themselves and whatever was coming. I stood there in the clearing surrounded by 3 dead rogues and painted with blood that was both mine and theirs, my silver hair whipping around my face in a wind that had picked up from nowhere, my eyes still glowing with that strange protective light. And I watched as the largest wolf I'd ever seen in my entire life exploded from the tree line with a dozen more silver wolves at his heels, all of them moving with the coordinated precision of elite warriors, all of them radiating power and purpose and barely leashed violence. The lead wolf was absolutely massive, easily standing 6 feet at the shoulder, with fur that was pure silver like polished steel, like moonlight given physical form, like living metal that rippled and flowed with each powerful stride. And his eyes were the blue of Arctic ice, of frozen oceans, of winter skies at their coldest and most unforgiving. And when those eyes locked onto me, I felt something snap into place in my chest, with such force that I actually stumbled backward, felt a connection forge itself between us that was stronger than anything I'd ever experienced, stronger than the mate bond I'd almost formed with Damien, stronger than blood or pack or any loyalty I'd ever known. This was the mate bond in its truest and most powerful form. This was destiny and fate and the moon goddess herself reaching down and declaring that this wolf, this magnificent creature of power and fury and barely contained violence, was mine, was meant for me, was the other half of my soul that I hadn't even known I was missing until this very moment when everything in the universe aligned and clicked into place, with the kind of rightness that made every moment of suffering that had led me here suddenly make perfect, terrible, beautiful sense. The massive silver wolf shifted mid-stride in that fluid way that powerful alphas could manage, transforming from wolf to man without breaking pace. And suddenly, there was a warrior standing before me who looked like he'd stepped out of ancient legends, out of sagas about Viking kings and northern raiders, and men who ruled through strength and honor and absolute uncompromising will. He was tall, so tall that I had to tilt my head back to meet his eyes, even though he was still 20 feet away, with broad shoulders and arms thick with muscle that was clearly earned through combat rather than vanity, with long silver hair that was darker than his wolf form, more steel than moonlight, worn in intricate braids that spoke of status and tradition, and a culture I didn't understand, but suddenly desperately wanted to learn. His face was all sharp angles and hard lines, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw covered in a neatly trimmed silver beard, with scars that marked him as a survivor of countless battles, with an intensity in those ice-blue eyes that made me feel seen and known and valued in a way that was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. And when he spoke, his voice was deep and rough and carried the weight of absolute command, tempered with something that might have been wonder or shock, or perhaps recognition that matched my own. "You saved them," he said, and it wasn't a question, but rather a statement of fact, delivered with the kind of certainty that suggested he'd already assessed the entire scene. had already catalogued the dead rogues and my injuries and the blood painting the snow, had already understood exactly what had happened here and what it meant. You stood against 5 rogues alone, with nothing but a knife and courage. You protected my children when you had no reason to help them, when you could have hidden, or run, or saved yourself, and you were prepared to die to keep them safe. And with each word his voice grew rougher, grew more laden with emotion that seemed too big for even his massive frame to contain. And I saw his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides, like he was physically restraining himself from reaching for me, from crossing the distance between us, and confirming what we both clearly felt pulsing in the air, like electricity before a storm. The children, I managed to say through lips that were numb from cold and shock and blood loss, through a throat that was closing up with emotions I didn't have names for, through the overwhelming realization that this man, this alpha, this king, was my mate, was the person the moon goddess had chosen for me. And how could that possibly be right when I was just a rejected omega with cursed silver hair and no pack and no worth? The children are in the cave. They're hurt, but alive. 1 has a broken leg, and 3 have fevers, and they're all terrified, but they're alive, and you need to get to them. You need to let them know their father found them. And I saw something flicker in his ice blue eyes at that, saw understanding and confirmation and a grief so deep it was almost physical. And he turned to bark orders at the wolves behind him in a language I didn't understand, but that they clearly did, because half of them immediately headed for the cave, while the others fanned out to secure the perimeter and track the rogues who'd fled. "Papa! Papa!" The screams came from the cave entrance as 6 silver-haired children poured out like a flood of joy and relief and desperate need as they threw themselves at the Viking king with complete trust and abandon, as they cried and laughed and babbled over each other, trying to tell him everything at once about the attack and the cave and the scary rogues and the silver lady who'd fought to protect them. He dropped to his knees in the snow to gather them all into his arms, to hold them with a tenderness that seemed impossible for someone his size, for someone who radiated such power and violence. And I saw tears tracking through the blood and dirt on his face as he checked each child for injuries, as he murmured reassurances in that rough, deep voice, as he pressed kisses to silver hair and foreheads, and promised them over and over that they were safe now, that Papa had them, that nothing would ever hurt them again. Little Rune, the 4-year-old who'd fallen asleep in my lap, wriggled out of his father's arms and ran back to me, wrapped his small arms around my legs with surprising strength, and looked up at me with those huge gray eyes full of worship and trust and innocent certainty, as he declared in a voice that carried clearly across the clearing, "Don't let the angel die, Papa. She saved us. She fought the bad wolves. She's magic like us with silver hair. You have to keep her. You have to make her stay." The Viking king rose to his full height with Rune's words still hanging in the air between us, rose and crossed the distance I'd thought he was maintaining for my comfort or his restraint, crossed it in 3 long strides that ate up the space until he was standing directly in front of me, so close I could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell pine and winter, and something wild and masculine that made my wolf want to roll over and expose her throat in submission, while simultaneously wanting to bite and claim and mark him as thoroughly as he clearly wanted to mark me. "You're hurt," he said, and his voice had gone soft, in a way that was somehow more devastating than his earlier commands, had gone gentle and concerned and intimate in a way that made my eyes sting with tears I absolutely would not let fall. "You're bleeding and exhausted, and half frozen, and you still stood between my children and death. You still fought when anyone else would have run. You still protected them at the cost of your own safety and your own life. And I don't even know your name, but I know that you're mine. Know that the moon goddess sent you here for this moment, for my children, for me. Know that you're my mate, and I'm never letting you go. The words should have terrified me, should have sent me running, because hadn't I just been rejected? Hadn't I just learned that mate bonds were fragile things that could be broken on a whim? Hadn't I just walked away from everything I'd ever known because someone had decided I wasn't good enough? But instead of fear, I felt only a bone-deep certainty that this was different, that he was different, that what pulsed between us was something unbreakable and true, and meant in a way that my almost bond with Damien had never been. "My name is Sarah," I whispered. "Sarah Nightshade, and I'm nobody. I'm just a rejected Omega, with no pack and cursed silver hair that marks me as strange and wrong and unnatural. And I don't understand why the moon goddess would give someone like you, someone like me. Don't understand why you're looking at me like I'm something precious when I'm just broken and used up and worthless." My voice cracked on the last word, and the tears I'd been holding back finally escaped, tracking hot lines down my frozen cheeks, and I saw his expression shift from wonder to fury in an instant. Saw his hands come up to cup my face with a gentleness that seemed impossible for someone capable of the violence I'd witnessed. "You are not worthless," he said, and each word was delivered with the kind of intensity that made them feel like vows, like promises carved in stone and sealed with blood. "You are a hero who saved 6 royal children at nearly the cost of your own life. You are a warrior who fought 5 rogues alone and won. You are my mate, chosen by the moon goddess herself, and your silver hair is not a curse, but a blessing, a mark that you were meant for greatness, meant to stand beside me, meant to be the mother my children need and the queen my kingdom deserves." And before I could protest or argue or tell him all the reasons he was wrong, before I could explain about Damien and the rejection and all the ways I'd proven that I wasn't strong enough or good enough or worthy enough, he kissed me with a passion and tenderness that erased every doubt, that rewrote every belief I'd held about my own worthlessness, that made the mate bond between us flare so bright and hot and undeniable that I gasped against his mouth and felt power flood through me that had nothing to do with the protective instincts that had awakened during the fight, and everything to do with this man, this alpha, this mate, who just claimed me before the moon goddess and his children and his warriors with an absoluteness that left no room for doubt or fear or the poison of past rejections. The weeks that followed were a blur of healing and learning, and slowly, carefully, letting myself believe that this was real, that I wasn't going to wake up alone in the snow having dreamed the whole thing, that the Viking king, whose name I learned, was Thorin. Silvermane really did want me, not despite my appearance, but in part because of it, because in his culture, silver hair was a mark of blessing, because his children all carried the same coloring, because his dead mate had black hair and he'd loved her deeply. But what we had was different, was new, was a second chance that neither of us had expected, but both of us desperately needed. He told me about his kingdom in the far north, about the culture that valued strength and honor and protection of family above all else, about how he'd been searching frantically for 3 days after the ambush that had killed his 12 elite guards and scattered his children into the wilderness, about how he'd been half mad with fear and grief and rage when he'd finally tracked them to that cave and found me instead, found his mate standing over the bodies of rogues with silver light pouring from her eyes, and his children safe behind her. I told him about my own past, in fragments and pieces, that got easier to share as time went on. Told him about the rejection and the banishment and the belief that I was cursed. Told him about walking into the mountains to die and instead finding his children and a purpose I'd never known I was searching for. And with each confession, he held me tighter and swore with increasing creativity and vehemence what he would do to Damien Ironridge if he ever had the misfortune of crossing the Viking king's path. The children, those 6 silver-haired blessings who'd given me back my life when I'd been ready to throw it away, took to calling me Mama within the first week, took to following me around the palace with the kind of devotion and trust that simultaneously healed my wounded heart and terrified me, because what if I failed them? What if I wasn't good enough? What if I proved Damien right and turned out to be too weak or too cursed or too fundamentally flawed to be the mother they deserved? But Thorn was patient and steady and absolutely unwavering in his faith in me, was there to catch me every time I stumbled, was there to remind me that love wasn't about being perfect, but about showing up and trying and choosing every day to be present for the people who needed you. And slowly, painfully, beautifully, I began to believe him, began to believe that maybe the moon goddess really had marked me with silver hair, not as a curse, but as a sign that I was meant for this family, this king, this life that had seemed impossible just weeks before. The day I finally agreed to complete the mate bond, to let Thorin mark me officially before his pack and his kingdom, was both terrifying and liberating, was letting go of the last vestiges of the girl who'd believed Damien's lies about her worthlessness and embracing the woman I was becoming under Thorin's steady love and the children's innocent faith. And when his teeth sank into my neck and the bond locked into place permanently, I felt every broken piece of my heart finally snap back together. Felt whole for the first time in my life. Felt like I'd finally come home. Years later, when I stood as Luna Queen of the Northern Crown with silver hair that no longer brought whispers, but rather respect, when I held counsel and made decisions that affected thousands of wolves, when I trained young, rejected Omegas in the arts of self-defense and taught them that their differences weren't weaknesses, but rather strengths waiting to be discovered, I would think back to that moment in the cave when I'd chosen to protect 6 children I didn't know at the cost of my own life, would think about how that single decision had led me to everything I'd been searching for without knowing I was searching, would think about how rejection and pain and walking into a blizzard to die had actually been the path that led me to my true destiny, to my mate, to my family, to myself. The silver-haired Omega who'd been cast out as cursed had become the Silver Queen, the guardian Luna, the mother of 6 royal children and eventually 2 more of my own with Thorin, the woman who proved that sometimes the moon goddess's greatest blessings come wrapped in our deepest pain, that sometimes we have to lose everything before we can find what we were truly meant to have, that sometimes the people who reject us are actually setting us free to find those who will value us properly, and that silver hair was never, ever a curse, but rather always a mark of something far more precious and powerful and beautiful than any of us had ever imagined. So if you're out there tonight, if you're the one who was rejected or cast out or told you weren't good enough, if you're the one with the strange appearance or the difficult gift or the qualities that made others uncomfortable, if you're the one who's walking into your own blizzard thinking this is the end, thinking there's nothing left worth living for, please hear me when I tell you that your story isn't over, that your rejection might actually be your redirection, that the moon goddess hasn't forgotten you, that somewhere in the world there are children who need you to save them, and a mate who's searching for you, and a destiny that's waiting for you to be brave enough to survive long enough to reach it, and your silver hair, whatever form it takes, Whatever makes you different and strange and marked, that isn't your curse. That's your crown. And someday, you're going to wear it with the pride and power it deserves, and everyone who couldn't see your value will finally understand exactly what they lost when they let you walk away. What did you think of Sarah and Thorin's story? Did the journey from rejection to redemption resonate with you? Have you ever felt like your differences were curses only to discover they were actually blessings in disguise? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story touched your heart, or gave you hope, or simply entertained you for a little while, please consider subscribing to this channel so you never miss another tale of werewolves and alphas and omegas who discover that their worth was never determined by those who rejected them, but rather by their own courage, their own choices, and their own willingness to protect and love, even when the world had given them every reason not to. Your support means everything and allows me to keep creating these stories of second chances and fated mates, and the kind of love that heals even the deepest wounds. So please hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join me for the next story, because I promise you, there are so many more tales to tell about wolves who were underestimated, rejected, cast aside, and who rose from those ashes to become queens and kings and legends. Thank you for reading, thank you for being here, and I'll see you in the next story.